So after I got engaged, I know it's quite a cliche, I've begun to notice that I've never really set a precedent for my belief, and I think that that will extremely damage my legacy and in terms of my audience going forward. I have collected such a huge audience of people, and glory be to God, I'm deeply humbled. Going into the next year, I want to clearly outline my projects, and to do that, I have to kind of confess my beliefs and be honest to God, the community that I've kind of gained, my family, and now my fiance. So I thought I'd be honest and go through each of my positions in a very clear way to ensure that I'm actually picking up the right audience for myself. So firstly, in terms of nationalism, there are three different sort of nationalists on the political right: Christian nationalists, ethno-nationalists, civic nationalists. And they all try to talk about and argue for a preservation of three different things: ethnicity, religion, and culture. And I think that being homogenous, you have to preserve all of these three things, and they all must be in the majority, demographically speaking. So I believe that we must preserve our ethnicity. I believe that we have to preserve our religion. I believe that we have to preserve our culture and also our language and land in terms of, being green, right? And all of these three things essentially blur into the same sort of nationalism, fundamentally putting Britain first and loving your homeland, loving your people, your tribe, so on and so forth. And there's very much a Christian element of God empowering. Now, mind you, if you actually look at the Tower of Babel, the reason why we have different languages and people is because of God. God enables borders. God enables the love for one's tribe. If you look at the Old Testament, he exclusively loved one tribe of people. So I think that Christians can actually hold to this position. And interestingly, a polemic from the sort of centre-right Christian nationalists is, would you rather 100% Christian Somalian population in England, or would you rather 100% native atheist population? And for that, I would say, what is more difficult? The preservation and demographic reversement of ethnicity or religion? Now, if I believe my religion's from God, I would argue that the easiest thing to sort of preserve would be your ethnicity, because it's more difficult to reverse that change. So I would say 100% native population. Now, short going off to the other sort of big topic would be Zionism. What is my take on the sort of right for the Jews to own the homeland? Now, as you can tell, and I've done it to sort of prove to myself I still hold to my Orthodox roots, I have all my icons here. I've all slowly bought them from different churches that I've attended throughout my time, and I wanted to be honest to my Orthodox father, my church, and to the whole world. I'm not an evangelical, I'm an Hellenizer, and what that means is that we are not inherently Zionists. I'm an isolationist. I believe that having a diplomatic relationship with Israel is more socially and economically beneficial. Sure, outside of that, do I care about what's going on in the Middle East? Absolutely not. I want to put, and I say this again, Britain first, the British people first. What is ever beneficial towards Britain, I will always push for. And having unnecessary wars is not something which puts Britain first. So I just want to make that very clear. Of course, I'll share in the same platform with different priests and Tommy Robinson himself. I don't think people are bought for. If you actually look, it's very much an American imported concept, because people like Tommy, they rely on small, repetitious donations, right? They're not paid for shields. If you look at Tommy Robinson, he's had a long and genuine, authentic history of supporting Israel. So I don't think he's a threat. I think he's a man to work with. I actually think he's quite genuine. I've spoke to him many times, and hopefully we can agree to disagree. Of course, I'm apathetical towards what he takes about Israel. I don't really care. There are different Orthodox Christians like Apostate Prophet, which has a strong Israeli position. However, it would be like you asking me about the sort of economic platform of a political party. This is not for me to say. So please, I don't know where this sort of idea has come from, that I'm like massively pro-Israeli or a massive pro-Zionist, because I'm not. It's not for me to say. The only thing I would say is I'm not a dispensationalist. I believe that we no longer, and everyone uses this this sort of section from Genesis 21 about honoring the Jews. I no longer believe that's an obligation, because I believe that we're all Jewish. Of course, the ethno-nationalists always like to point to that video at me at Speaker's Corner saying as such, because we are all Jews. We're all God's chosen people. We're all glorified and honored in his kingdom, which Christ has brought in his church. So I just wanted to make that very clear. And the sort of final thing I'd go on to say, or the sort of controversy I want to kind of, if you're still here and not mad at me, would be the reasons why I left. Oh, sorry about that. The reasons why I left Turning Point UK. And the reason why I left, and I say that I left and I totally wasn't just suspended, was because I decided to openly critique, quite ironically, the organisation which pushes for the free marketplace of ideas. So I already am sort of questionable why someone who's spent about 2 years worth of effort, and that was the reason why I quite in a fast fashion responded, because, you know, Jack and Nick, they're good company to have. I do fundamentally agree with that. However, the way they run their business in terms of a youth organisation, I incredibly disagree, and I think it's disingenuous. So I just want to make that they're beautiful people, never give them flack. However, why can you kick out someone who pushes the free marketplace of ideas just for saying something that you disagree with, and I think is a very well-merited argument against the way that they fundamentally run Turning Point UK? And I'll give you a good example. If you go on their social media pages, and they're all monetized, by the way. This is the sole way that they get money. It's through re-uploaded videos of Charlie Kirk, which in my eyes is just grave robbery. I think that you're just essentially stealing content off another man, off another organization. They never receive organizational or financial support from Turning Point USA, because, and you've got to question yourself, why, when Charlie went to Oxford, did he never visit anyone from Turning Point UK? It's because there was no sort of growth or motivation or a shared work ethic within Turning Point UK than there was in Turning Point USA. That is the reason why he never visited, was because they never shared in the same vision, they only shared in the same way, which is largely why I said I probably regret it, because a grift is sort of a weird sort of term that everyone applies to themselves. And I go into lastly how I'm funded. So yeah, they just re-upload other people's videos, and that is how they run their organisation. And the reason why I said it was a grift was, firstly, like I said before, it was quite personal for me leaving an organisation that I'd worked for 2 years. And secondly, if you're a predominantly protest organisation, the outgoings in a protest is a PA system, which you use the same one all the time, banners, which you largely use the same, excluding the ones that you actually get donated or you get sponsored for. So if there's no outgoings and you're receiving an income from other people's videos, which means you're not paying for them at all, outside of the legacy costs to the states in terms of sharing in the revenue of the old Charlie Kirk videos, why could you never cover the cost of travel, the cameraman that I had to pay for, the branding that I had to pay for, the banners, so on and so forth, literally everything that you have seen in recent history in terms of what I've promoted at Talk TV or what I've done on social media, I've always had to fund, which is ridiculous. And more pressingly, when I was planning on engaging my fiancée, I was looking towards getting a house. I wanted to start a family quite early, and I can't do that if I have an organisation which expects me to act like an employee in terms of publicly defending the practices that I disagree with without actually being paid. I think it's incredibly unfortunate. And I want to go into another reason why I disagreed with Turning Point UK. And students, which have publicly condemned me, actually have said the same things in more of a severe way, who actually work for Turning Point. And that is the anointment of Nick. Now, of course, you have to be loyal to the people you're loyal to, right? I don't think you should just throw Nick Tanconi under the bus. However, it is very questionable why you have a small right-wing party which actively talks out against people like the Tories, like Reform, and have them at the top brass of your organisation. So if you're the leader of a political movement, and that is different from being a member of UKIP, by the way, you already exclude everyone who doesn't fundamentally agree with your form of politics, which is extremely divisive, considering that you have tried to march down Whitechapel, which a lot of people disagree with, a lot of people on the moderate right, which are trying to bring into Turning Point, because mind you, Turning Point is a broad church. We are trying to, when we're at universities, push for right-wing students to join us. Now, that comes from generationally wealthy Tories and the lost people of politics, which are reformers. Reformers don't like UKIP because they're trying to challenge the space that reform occupy. The Conservatives are snobby, so they don't like small protest movements. So having the leader of a already disenfranchised organisation like UKIP to essentially be one of the top guys at Turning Point immediately turns people off, and it's one of the other reasons why Turning Point has never been successful. For example, if you actually look, and the reason why I say this is because I was actually helping work to build the new Turning Point website, which looks beautiful, by the way. It was originally advertised that there was 30 plus chapters at Turning Point UK. The reason being was because there were, at some point, large chapters. And that was when George Farmer was running it. There was a year where a lot of the Americans and a lot of people, a lot of rich people like Farage, were endorsing and helping Turning Point UK. Then they have to unfortunately sell it off because I believe Trump didn't get re-elected. However, in that year, it was actually what Turning Point USA is. And that is why if you actually go on their YouTube channel, and I convey you, please go on Turning Point UK, go towards the oldest video, and what you'll find is an organization which was thriving and actually bringing people towards social conservatism. And the reason being is because it had the backing of Farage. Farage even said that we have the Young Conservatives, which is a bunch of geeks. However, Charlie's vision for the United Kingdom is far more something which is consumable to the United Kingdom. So that is the reasons why I've always had grievances with the way it's managed. Of course, I would never use such harsh language publicly like I did at the Hope Not Hate article. However, I am relieved that a lot of my opinions were talked about, besides from the ones about Tommy, by the way, because that was a Muslim student for reform coming up to me and saying he was scared of his family, yada, yada, yada. And we're talking about the EDL days. It's largely taken out of context. However, I do fundamentally disagree with Nick's form of activism in UKIP and also Turning Point UK's management. But I absolutely adore those people. They're great. They're great company. They're lovely people, caring people. I do legitimately believe they're Christians, but I disagree with them, and I think we can have a hypercritical right, as you can tell from this video. However, what is the future have in store for young Bob? Besides from getting engaged and hopefully getting married when I turned 18, and at some point later down the line when I'm probably 20 or whatever, having kids, I want to start my own project where I believe that, like Farage said to Charlie, the Conservatives are a lost brand. If you think about young Conservatives, they're little geeks in square glasses. I think that young people are nationalists. They're not economically ideological. They're rather just wanting the best for their country. And you sort of saw that with the envisionment of Boris, because he kind of talked about being green in such a way of preserving and conservating the land because we have such a beautiful country. I want to keep that momentum, keep nationalism. Yes, conservatism socially, however, ideologically, whatever is best for the United Kingdom, push that. And I want to have a broad church of different people. So like you saw with Liam Tuff's platform, different people that disagree with each other, even Charlie Kirk with recently discussions on Israel, and have them on a ticketed event debate one another. And that is why I've decided with the Project Britannia, having a project which is young people for the sake of Britannia, the British Isles. And I think that's going to be really successful. I'm very excited to see what happens in the new year. However, I've had a lot off my chest. If there's anything else to discuss, I could probably talk about economics just quickly. William Beveridge, having a healthcare service cradle to grave. However, we are the 7th biggest employer at the NHS. I think if you spent the GDP of Nigeria, we'd only fund the NHS for about 6 months. So I think that we spend too much on a benefit and health system. So we need to cut back in terms of expenditure. However, still having a social welfare net system under a hardcore capitalist, free market, is a great way of running the economy and is a great way of running Britain. So that is my plans done in a very ranty way. However, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.